If you were anywhere near a television in the 1970s, you knew a Lotus when you saw one. The black and gold cars streaking to the front of a Grand Prix, the white Esprit that drove off a pier and turned into a submarine. Built from a former airfield in the flat Norfolk countryside, Lotus won 7 Formula One constructors' titles and beat Ferrari with a fraction of the money. It survived the death of its greatest driver. It survived being, by one insider's account, technically bankrupt for most of 30 years. It ran on the nerve and the genius of a single man, and it kept on winning. And then, at the end of 1982, after 30 years at the summit of the sport, that man was suddenly gone. And the proudest name in British motorsport was dragged to the very brink of collapse. How? How does a company that survived all of that come within a whisker of vanishing? What happened in those last months? Chapter 1. A garage behind the railway hotel. It begins, as so many of these stories do, with something small. A boy, a borrowed shed, and an old car that everyone else had given up on. In 1948, Britain was still counting the cost of the war. Sweets were rationed. Petrol was rationed. Whole streets in London waited for the rubble to be cleared. And in Muswell Hill, in the north of the city, a 20-year-old engineering student named Colin Chapman was buying and selling second-hand cars to make a bit of money on the side. His full name was Anthony Colin Bruce Chapman, born on the 19th of May 1928 in Richmond, Surrey, and raised at 44 Beach Drive in Muswell Hill. His father, Stanley, ran the Railway Hotel on Tottenham Lane in Hornsey, a pub beside the railway line, where the trains rattled the windows, and the regulars knew the boy by sight. Chapman grew up in the smell of beer and coal smoke, watching his father run a business, learning without knowing he was learning that a firm was a thing you kept alive by your wits. He was clever. Restlessly, impatiently clever. He went to the Stationers' Company's school, then to University College London to read structural engineering, and there he found the thing that would shape the rest of his life. Not cars, aeroplanes. He joined the University of London Air Squadron and learned to fly, and flying got into him the way it gets into certain men and never lets go. For the rest of his days he would pilot his own aircraft, and the tan he wore came from the open cockpit as much as the sun. He very nearly didn't graduate. He got so tangled in his car dealing that he failed a mathematics paper and left in 1948 without a degree, going back the following year to resit it and finally qualifying in 1950. But by then the other thing had already happened. In 1948, in that borrowed lockup, he had taken a battered Austin 7 and rebuilt it into a trials car, a lightweight little special for scrambling up muddy hills at weekend competitions. He called it the Lotus. Nobody has ever been quite sure why. Chapman took the reason to his grave, and the theories have multiplied ever since. The most tender of them is that it was his private name for the young woman he was courting, Hazel Williams, whom he had met at a dance at Hornsey Town Hall in March 1944. His Lotus Blossom. Whatever the truth, the name stuck to the car and then to everything that came after it. Hazel believed in him before anyone else did. When he needed capital to turn the tinkering into a trade, it wasn't a bank that backed him. It was Hazel, who lent him roughly £25 and gave him the run of her parents' lockup on Alexandra Park Road. £25. That was the seed of it all. On the 1st of January 1952, the Lotus Engineering Company Limited was formally born, with Chapman and a friend named Michael Allen as its directors. The works, if you could call it that, was the old stable block behind the Railway Hotel at 7 Tottenham Lane, lent by Chapman's father. Local children used the yard as a shortcut to school, threading between the half-built cars. The badge carried 4 letters wound together, A, C, B, C. Chapman's own initials. But there is a story, and it is a good one, that he told Michael Allen and his brother Nigel that the letters really stood for something else, Colin Chapman and the Allen brothers. The Allen brothers were the last of the founding gang, and Nigel Allen lived long enough to see almost everything that followed. He died in February 2025. Even in those first cars, before Lotus meant anything to anybody, the trait that would define Chapman was already showing. He didn't just build cars. He read the rule book like a man looking for the gap in a fence. On an early trials special, he wanted more airflow through the cylinder head than the regulations allowed. So he reversed the function of the ports. Inlet where the rules expected exhaust, exhaust where they expected inlet, and gained an advantage the scrutineers hadn't thought to forbid. It worked so well that the governing body eventually rewrote the rules to outlaw it. That was the pattern, set at the very beginning. Find the thing nobody had noticed, exploit it completely, and keep going until they change the law to stop you. There is a small confusion worth clearing up, because you'll find it in almost every telling. Some say Lotus began in 1948. Some say 1952. Both are right. 1948 was the first car, the Austin 7 in the shed. 1952 was the company, the stable behind the pub. The car came first. The business followed, chasing it. By 1959, the little firm had grown to around 30 people. The pub is still there, on Tottenham Lane. It's a shisha lounge and restaurant now. But for a few years in the early 50s, in the stable behind it, an innkeeper's son was quietly working out how to beat the world. Chapter 2. Simplify, then add lightness. He had a creed. 4 words that would build an empire and, in the end, help to endanger it. Simplify, then add lightness. It sounds like a paradox until you understand what he meant. Chapman's genius wasn't horsepower. Anyone could buy horsepower. His genius was in taking things away. Adding power makes you faster on the straights, he liked to say. Adding lightness makes you faster everywhere. Where his rivals bolted on strength, Chapman carved away everything a car didn't absolutely need to survive the race, and not 1 ounce more. It made his cars quick, nimble, and beautiful. It also made them fragile, and that would matter later in ways he could not yet imagine. At the end of 1954, he took the plunge. He left his steady job at British Aluminium, where he had been experimenting with alloys and aerodynamics, and went full-time on Lotus. No safety net. A young man betting everything on the idea that clever could beat rich. He was not alone. Around him gathered a group of men who would become legends in their own right. There was Mike Costin, a gifted development engineer, and Costin's friend Keith Duckworth, a brilliant, blunt-spoken designer who could not abide a badly made thing. Chapman couldn't afford to keep Duckworth, and Duckworth left to set up his own firm with Costin. They took the first 2 letters of each surname, Costin and Duckworth, and called it Cosworth. Remember that name. It comes back. And there was a mustachioed young mechanic on the Lotus payroll, a man who had come to cars late and worked on the shop floor to pay for his own racing. His name was Graham Hill. He would leave Lotus, come back, and one day become the only man ever to win the Triple Crown of motorsport. But in the mid-50s, he was just a lad with oily hands and enormous ambition, learning the trade in Chapman's workshop. In 1959, Lotus outgrew the stable and moved to a proper factory at Cheshunt in Hertfordshire, and it was there that Chapman built the car that announced he was something more than a weekend tinkerer, the Elite, the Type 14. The Elite was audacious. It was the world's first road car with a body built as a glass fibre monocoque. No separate steel chassis underneath, the fiberglass shell itself doing the structural work, carrying the loads. It was light. It was gorgeous, styled with help from an accountant-turned-designer named Peter Kerwin-Taylor, and it was, in the manner of early Lotus road cars, temperamental to the point of heartbreak. But it proved the theory. You could make a car strong by making it clever, not by making it heavy. The racing came alongside the road cars, and it came fast. Lotus entered Formula One in 1958 at Monaco, and in 1960, again at Monaco, a Lotus won its first Grand Prix, though not a works car. It was a Lotus 18 run by the private team of Rob Walker, driven by the great Stirling Moss. Moss took a customer Lotus and beat the factory Ferraris on the tightest, most demanding circuit in the world. Chapman had arrived. The man who took things away was beginning to take away everything his rivals thought they'd earned, and the best was still ahead of him, because he was about to meet the driver who would make his machines look like they'd been painted onto the road. Chapter 3. Clark and the Monocoque. Some partnerships are simply greater than the sum of their parts. Chapman and Jim Clark were one of those. Clark was a Scottish farmer's son from the borders, shy off the track and sublime on it, a driver of such natural smoothness that watching him could make the fastest car in the world look effortless, almost lazy, right up until you saw the lap times. Chapman built the cars. Clark drove them as though he could feel every gram of the lightness Chapman had chased. Between them, for the best part of a decade, they were close to unbeatable, and in 1962, Chapman gave Clark a weapon unlike anything the sport had seen. The problem every racing car faced was the same one the elite had answered on the road. A traditional car was built around a chassis, a frame of tubes, heavy, that everything else hung from. Chapman, working with his designer Maurice Philippe, threw the tubes away. The Lotus 25 was the first truly successful monocoque Formula One car. The body was the structure, a rigid aluminium tub in which the driver lay almost flat, the whole thing lighter and stiffer than anything the opposition had. Chapman is said to have sketched the idea on a napkin over lunch. Whether that's strictly true hardly matters. What matters is that it changed motor racing forever. Within a few years, every serious Grand Prix car in the world was a monocoque. They'd copied him. They always copied him. He was already 3 ideas further on. In 1963, Clark and the Lotus 25 simply took the championship apart. He won 7 of the 10 Grands Prix that season, a level of dominance that felt almost unfair. He won the title again in 1965, and in between, Chapman aimed at a target no European had any business hitting: the Indianapolis 500, the Great American Oval, the richest race on Earth, and for decades the private property of the front-engined roadsters that had always won it. Chapman brought a light, nimble, mid-engined Lotus 38 with a Ford engine behind the driver, and in 1965, Clark won. The first mid-engined car ever to win the Brickyard, the first Ford-powered victory there. The Americans had laughed at the little green cars. They stopped laughing. By then Lotus had moved again, to the place that would become its home for the rest of the story, Hethel in Norfolk, a former wartime airfield near Wymondham that Chapman bought in 1966. He turned the perimeter into a test track and, characteristically, kept the airstrip so he could fly himself in and out. From a stable behind a pub to a private aerodrome in the Norfolk countryside in 14 years. That was the pace of the man. He was winning championships, selling road cars, and beating the finest engineers in the world with a fraction of their budgets. But the cleverest thing Chapman ever did was still to come, and it started with a problem that looked for a moment like it might finish him. Chapter 4: The £100,000 Engine. Every racing team needs an engine, and in the mid-60s, Lotus was about to lose theirs. Chapman had been relying on engines from Coventry Climax, a superb little firm. But Climax decided to pull out of Formula One, and suddenly the man with the best chassis in the world had nothing to put in the back of it. A brilliant car with no heart. It was the kind of crisis that had ended other teams for good. Chapman's answer was audacious, even by his standards. He didn't go looking for another engine supplier. He went looking for someone to pay for an engine that didn't yet exist, one built exactly to his specification that he would have first. He found his man at Ford. Walter Hayes was Ford of Britain's public affairs chief, a former newspaperman who understood, better than most motor executives of the day, what winning races could do for a brand. Chapman convinced Hayes that for a fixed sum, Ford could fund a bespoke Grand Prix engine and put the blue oval on the most successful team in the sport. The figure was £100,000. Ford wrote the check. The engine was designed by Keith Duckworth, the same Duckworth whom Chapman, years earlier, hadn't been able to afford to keep. Cosworth built it, and they called it the DFV, the double 4-valve. And Duckworth did something with it that only makes sense when you remember Chapman's creed. He designed the engine to be part of the car, not a lump bolted into a frame, but a stressed member, the engine and gearbox themselves forming the rear structure of the chassis, so the car needed less frame and therefore less weight around it. Simplify, then add lightness. The whole philosophy cast in aluminium. They put it in a new car, the Lotus 49, and took it to the Dutch Grand Prix at Zandvoort in June 1967. Jim Clark drove it. It won. First time out. The very first race for an engine that would go on to become the most successful in the history of Formula One, powering cars to more Grand Prix victories than any before or since. A complete DFV cost around £7,500, and for the better part of 2 decades, it was the beating heart of British motor racing. Chapman had lost his engine, and, within a year, replaced it with the best one anyone would ever build, using somebody else's money to do it. The little firm from the stable behind the pub now sat at the absolute summit of world motorsport. And then, on a wet afternoon in Germany, everything Chapman thought was solid was shown to be as fragile as one of his own beautiful cars. Chapter 5: The Trees at Hockenheim, the 7th of April, 1968. It was not even a race that mattered. Jim Clark should not have been at Hockenheim that day. It was a Formula 2 event, a category well below his standing, and he had wanted to be somewhere else entirely, driving Ford's new sports prototype at Brands Hatch. He'd told Walter Hayes as much, but there was a contractual obligation to the tyre firm Firestone, and obligations were obligations, and so the greatest driver in the world went to a minor race on a fast, featureless circuit lined with pine trees. It was wet. On the fifth lap, on a flat-out section through the forest, Clark's Lotus veered off the road and into the trees. He was killed instantly. The most likely cause was mechanical, not human, a rear tyre slowly deflating, robbing the car of grip in the one place a driver could do nothing about it. Not a mistake. Just the machine, failing, at the worst possible moment. Chapman was away skiing. They reached him by telephone. The man who had beaten the world with cleverness and nerve was, by every account, utterly broken by the news. He said, simply and publicly, that he had lost his best friend. He spoke of stepping away from the sport altogether. Something in him never fully recovered from the trees at Hockenheim. There is a stone cross there now, in woods that have grown back around the spot, and men still leave flowers. But a company is a strange thing. It does not stop to grieve. There were cars half-built at Hethel, races on the calendar, wages to be paid, a workforce that believed in what it was doing, and the man who held the team together in that shattered season was the old mechanic with the oily hands and the enormous ambition. Graham Hill. Hill had come back to Lotus, and now he did the hardest thing in sport. He drove for a team that was mourning, in cars that had just killed its finest driver, and he won. He took the Lotus 49, now painted in the red, white and gold of Gold Leaf, the first major cigarette sponsorship Formula One had ever seen, and he won the 1968 World Championship. He dedicated it to Clark. It was a victory soaked in grief, but it proved something that would matter enormously for everything still to come. Lotus was no longer just one brilliant man and one brilliant driver. It had become an institution, deep enough, strong enough to lose the irreplaceable and carry on. Established, growing, wounded, but not stopped. The best years, the golden years, the black and gold years that would make Lotus a household name far beyond the racing world were still ahead. And so, though nobody at Hethel could have known it, was the deal that would very nearly bring the whole thing down. Chapter 6. The Works at Hethel. To understand what was lost, you have to walk through the gates first. So, walk through them. Hethel, Norfolk, in the middle of the 1970s. A flat, quiet stretch of farmland where the old wartime runways still cut across the fields, and where a low spread of buildings had grown up around them. The home of Lotus. There was no great Victorian chimney here, no soot-blackened brick. Lotus didn't look like the industrial Britain of the North and the Midlands. It looked like what it was, a modern engineering company that had planted itself in the countryside and gone about beating the world quietly. The first thing that reached you, before you saw anything, was the smell. Not coal, not hot metal. Resin. The sharp, chemical, faintly sweet smell of glass fibre and the catalysts that cured it. A smell that got into your overalls and your hair and stayed with you, so that years later a whiff of it in a boatyard or a bath factory could stop a former Lotus worker in the street. Because glass fibre was how Lotus built its road cars, and building a car body out of glass fibre was messy, skilled, human work. For years the trade had done it the crude way, hand-laying mats of glass fibre into a mould, brushing in the resin, hoping the thickness came out even. Chapman hated waste, and he hated inconsistency, and so Lotus developed something better and gave it a name that sounded like a spell. VARI. Vacuum-assisted resin injection. You laid the dry glass fibre into a 2-part mould, closed it, and drew the liquid resin through under vacuum, so that it soaked the fibre evenly, and the two halves of a car's body came out clean, matched, and repeatable. It was clever. It was, in its way, another expression of the creed. Take the mess out. Take the weight out. Make the light thing well. The men and women who ran that process were craftspeople, whatever the trade unions and the wage grades called them. Laying up a body, trimming the cured shell, fettling the joins by hand. This was skill you built over years, and the workforce knew it. A body would come out of the mould and be lifted, bonded to its backbone chassis. A steel spine running down the centre of the car, another Lotus signature, And slowly, down the line, a shape would become a motor car. And what a shape! In 1975, at the Paris Motor Show, Lotus unveiled the car that would define the era and, before long, become one of the most famous machines on Earth. The Esprit. Its body was the work of an Italian designer, Giorgetto Giugiaro, and it was pure origami. A low, sharp, folded wedge, all straight lines and flat planes, looking less like the curvy sports cars of the 60s than like something that had arrived from a future nobody had seen yet. Production began in the summer of 1976. It was not a fast car by the numbers. It didn't need to be. It looked like it was doing 100 miles an hour sitting still in a car park. Running the engineering side of all this was a man who had joined Lotus in 1969 as a young engineer and would rise in time to run the whole company. Mike Kimberley. He belonged to a generation of Lotus men who genuinely believed, without arrogance and without much evidence to the contrary, that this small Norfolk firm could outthink anyone. They had the championships to prove it. They had a road car that turned heads in Monte Carlo and Mayfair. And they had something the balance sheet never quite captured. A conviction, shared from the drawing office to the moulding shop, that they were the best in the world at what they did. They may even have been right. That's what makes the rest of the story so hard. Chapter 7. The team that thought it was the best in the world. Lotus was really two companies wearing one badge, and the golden age belonged to both of them. There was the road car business at Hethel, the moulding shops, the assembly line, the engineers turning out elites and éclats and esprits, and there was the racing team, Team Lotus, which was Chapman's first love and his cathedral. The two fed each other. The glamour of the Grand Prix wins sold the road cars. The road cars, and increasingly, a quiet engineering consultancy business helped keep the lights on. It was a delicate balance, and it worked, mostly, for a very long time, though how delicate it truly was, we'll come to. The racing side had a culture all its own, and at its heart, always, was Hazel. Hazel Chapman. She and Colin had married, and the £25 she'd once lent him had bought her a front row seat at the making of history. She was there on the pit wall with a stopwatch, a genuine part of the operation, not an ornament. She helped found the Doghouse Club, bringing together the wives and partners of the racing world at a time when Grand Prix motor racing killed men with terrible regularity, and the women who loved them needed each other. On the pit wall beside her, over the years, you might find Betty Hill, Graham's wife, or Nina Rent. These were not spectators. This was a community, held together in the shadow of real danger. Around Chapman gathered the men who built the cars. There was Peter Waugh, the team manager who ran the racing operation. There was the design office, where the machines were dreamed up. And there was Fred Bushell. And here we must pause, because Fred Bushell matters more to the end of this story than almost anyone. Bushell was the finance director, Chapman's right-hand man, the numbers to Chapman's imagination. He had been with Lotus since the early days, and he understood the money in a way Chapman, for all his brilliance, could not be bothered to. Where Chapman saw an aerofoil, Bushell saw a balance sheet. He was loyal, discreet, and utterly devoted to the man he served. Remember him. He is standing quietly at the edge of every triumph in this chapter, and one day he will go to prison rather than say a word against the man beside whom he stood. The workforce at Hethel felt the pride of all this keenly. To work at Lotus was to work somewhere that beat Ferrari, actual Ferrari, with all its money and its history and its scarlet romance, on Sunday afternoons, on the television, in front of the world. A man laying up an Esprit body on Monday morning had watched a Lotus lead a Grand Prix the day before. The connection was real. The little firm in the Norfolk fields was, for a while, the beating heart of British engineering pride, and the people inside it knew it. Chapman himself moved through it all like a force of nature, flying in and out of his own airstrip, tanned, restless, hurling his flat cap into the air when a Lotus crossed the line first, a gesture the crowds came to know and love. He was demanding, mercurial, and impossible, and the people who worked for him would have followed him anywhere. That too is part of what makes the ending so painful. This wasn't a faceless corporation. It was a man and the people who believed in him. And in 1977 and 1978, that man was about to produce the single most beautiful and most dominant thing he ever built. Chapter 8. Black Beauty and the Bond Car. It started, as Chapman's best ideas often did, with something everyone else had thrown away. Two engineers, Peter Wright and Tony Rudd, had both come to Lotus from BRM, and both carried with them the memory of an abandoned experiment, wind tunnel work from the late 60s, suggesting that the shape of a car's underside might do something strange and powerful in the flow of air beneath it. At Lotus, with Chapman's blessing and the wind tunnel at Imperial College in London, they chased it down, and what they found changed Formula One forever. If you shaped the underside of the car like an upside-down aeroplane wing and ran it close to the ground, the air rushing underneath didn't just pass through, it generated suction. The car was pulled down onto the road, pressed into the tarmac by the very air it drove through, so that it could corner at speeds that should have been impossible. They sealed the edges with sliding skirts to keep the low pressure from leaking away. They had invented, or at least perfected and unleashed, what the world would come to call ground effect. The first car to carry it was the Lotus 78 in 1977. Mario Andretti, the team's charismatic Italian-American number one, described driving it as being painted to the road. And here was the truly Chapman touch, the misdirection. Rather than let their rivals work out the secret, Lotus put it about that the 78's uncanny grip came from a clever differential. For a whole season, the finest engineers in the sport looked in entirely the wrong place, while Lotus quietly cornered faster than anyone alive. Then, in 1978, came the masterpiece. The Lotus 79, painted in the black and gold of its sponsor, John Player Special, a livery so gorgeous the car earned a nickname that stuck for all time, Black Beauty. It refined ground effect to perfection, and it was so far ahead that Andretti said driving the older 78 by comparison felt like driving a London bus. Lotus won the Constructors' Championship that year with 86 points, 58 clear of Ferrari. Andretti took the driver's title. The little firm from the stable behind the pub now held its seventh Constructors' crown and had put 6 different men in the record books, from Clark to Hill to the young Brazilian Emerson Fittipaldi, who had taken the title in the black and gold Lotus back in 1972. But racing was only half of why the world now knew the name. The other half came out of the sea. In 1977, in the James Bond film The Spy Who Loved Me, an Esprit was driven off a pier and turned, before the audience's eyes, into a submarine. It swam, it fired missiles at a helicopter, and it became, instantly and permanently, one of the most beloved film cars ever made. The trick was that Lotus almost didn't get the job at all, until the company's PR man, Don McLaughlin, simply parked a pre-production Esprit outside the gates of Pinewood Studios, unmarked and mysterious, and let the producer's curiosity do the rest. The working submarine itself was built by a firm in Florida for well over $100,000 and driven underwater by a retired American Navy diver. To the audience, none of that mattered. What mattered was that a British sports car had become a thing of pure wonder. That was the summit. A car that ruled Grand Prix racing and a car that swam through a Bond film, both wearing the same name, both born in the Norfolk fields. In 1978, there was no more glamorous, more admired, more untouchable name in British engineering than Lotus, which is exactly the moment to be afraid. Chapter 9. The Summit, 1978. Read the year and hold it, because from up here the only direction is down. On the face of it, Lotus had never been stronger. World champions, a Bond car, a road car line that turned heads, a founder at the height of his fame and his powers, flying his own aircraft between the factory and the racetracks of Europe, still finding advantages nobody else had spotted. From the outside, from the grandstands, from the showrooms, from the front pages, it looked like a company that had solved the problem of how to win. But the triumph of 1978 carried a shadow within it, and the shadow had a name: Ronnie Peterson. The brilliant, generous Swedish driver was Andretti's teammate, and at Monza that September, having damaged his Lotus 79, he was put into the older 78 for the race. At the start, there was a pile-up, and Peterson's legs were badly broken. The injuries themselves were survivable. He died the next morning of complications, a fatal embolism. And so, Andretti clinched his world championship on the very weekend his teammate and friend was killed. Unfortunately, Andretti said, motor racing is also this. The greatest season in the company's history was sealed in mourning, just as 1968 had been. Triumph and grief, wound together, again. There was another shadow, quieter, that the crowds never saw. For all the glamour, Lotus was not a rich company. It never really had been. One insider would later say the firm had been technically bankrupt for most of the 30 years of Chapman's stewardship. Always brilliant, always winning, always one bad season or one soft market away from real trouble. The racing consumed money. The road cars sold in the hundreds, not the hundreds of thousands, and they sold to a narrow, wealthy, fickle clientele. The whole enterprise ran on Chapman's nerve and Bushell's arithmetic and the assumption that the good times would keep coming, and the man at the center of it wanted more. Chapman had built the most successful marque in the history of Grand Prix racing, and it had not made him the kind of money that men of far less genius seemed to make elsewhere. He had, by some accounts, been refused a modest government grant for his own racing efforts. He watched other men, flashier men, men who had built nothing like what he had built, walk away with fortunes and mansions and aeroplanes, and something in him seemed to conclude that the gilded life those men enjoyed should, by rights, have been his. That is a dangerous thing for a proud man to start believing. It leaves a door open. In 1978, standing at the absolute summit of British motorsport, Colin Chapman could not see the cliff, but he was already walking towards it, because a charismatic American with a dream car and a mountain of British government money had just come looking for the cleverest engineer in the world. And Chapman had said, yes. Chapter 10. The American and the Innkeeper's Son. He arrived like a man from a different film entirely. John Zachary DeLorean was everything Chapman was not, and everything, perhaps, that Chapman had started to wish he could be. Born in Detroit in 1925, the son of a Ford factory worker, he had clawed his way up through the American motor industry until he became the youngest division head in the history of General Motors. The man behind the Pontiac GTO, the car that arguably invented the muscle car craze. He was tall, tanned and remade. He'd had the cosmetic surgery, married the models, moved among film stars. In 1973, he walked away from a near-certain shot at the very top of General Motors to build a car under his own name. A dream car, a gullwing, stainless steel sports car that would carry the letters DMC and, he promised, change the world. Two charismatic men then, two dreamers, one who built the lightest, cleverest cars on earth from a stable behind a pub, and one who sold a vision so shining that governments queued up to fund it. When they met, in the summer of 1978, the chemistry was immediate and, in hindsight, catastrophic. DeLorean needed an engineer, and he needed one fast. He had a design drawn up by a former General Motors man named Bill Collins, but it was years from production, and DeLorean did not have years. He had gone to Porsche, and Porsche had told him 4 years. He had gone to BMW, and BMW had told him 7. He wanted his car in roughly 2. There was really only one man in the world arrogant enough to say yes to that, and clever enough to have a chance of delivering it. So Colin Chapman took the job. Lotus swept aside Bill Collins' original design and rebuilt the DeLorean around what it knew, an Esprit-derived steel backbone chassis, molded body panels, the whole Lotus philosophy pressed into service for an American's dream. It was brilliant, rapid engineering. It was also, whatever the critics later said, not simply a reskinned Esprit. That's a lazy line worth resisting. But the car that emerged was heavier than DeLorean had wanted, some 500 pounds heavier than planned, powered by a modest French-built V6 that gave it the look of a rocket and the pace of a saloon. The promise always outran the metal. And here is where the story stops being about cars at all, and becomes about something much larger and much sadder. Because DeLorean's dream needed a factory, and a factory needed money, and DeLorean had found somewhere desperate enough to give him extraordinary amounts of it, Northern Ireland. It was the late 1970s, the Troubles at their bloodiest, and the British government was searching for anything that might bring jobs and hope to communities tearing themselves apart. DeLorean was offered a site at Dunmurry in West Belfast, in an area of roughly 50% male unemployment. The plan was so freighted with hope, it broke your heart to read it. The factory was built with 2 gates, one at the Catholic end, one at the Protestant end, so that men who would not walk the same streets might at least build the same cars. The Labour Secretary of State, Roy Mason, told the Prime Minister the plant could save soldiers' lives by giving 2,000 men a wage and a reason to get up in the morning. The master agreement was signed on the 28th of July 1978, just 46 days after the first introductions. 46 days. Over the 4 years that followed, DeLorean's venture would draw down around £77 million of British taxpayers' money, equity, grants, loans, employment subsidies, 3 years rent-free. It was one of the largest gambles of public money on a single private car ever made in these islands. Somewhere in all of this, in the rush, in the glamour, in the sheer volume of money sloshing between London, Belfast, Detroit and Geneva, a door was left open, and 2 men who should have known better walked through it. For Chapman and Fred Bushell had a habit. For years they had used an offshore company to handle certain payments, to route money in ways that reduced what Lotus and its drivers owed the British taxman. The company had begun life as a Panamanian shelf firm and had been given a name and a purpose, GPD Services. There was nothing yet criminal in it. Tax planning is not tax fraud, and Chapman was not the only man in motorsport playing that game. He was, by all accounts, rather proud of it. But GPD was already there, already offshore, already a vehicle built to move money quietly out of sight. And now, into that quiet little company, there was about to flow a river of DeLorean's millions. The engineering was real. The Norfolk men did brilliant, genuine work, and it was billed and paid for through proper channels, the ordinary way, directly to DeLorean's firm. That work was never the problem. The problem was the other channel. The one that ran through Panama and Geneva and bore the name of engineering, it was never really paying for. Nobody at Hethel laying up a body that Autumn knew any of this. Why would they? The team was still world champion. The Bond car still swam. The caps still went up when a Lotus crossed the line. The best firm in the world, they still believed, and they had the trophies to say so. But the deal was done. The signatures were dry, and the cleverest engineer in Britain had just tied the fate of his life's work, and, though he could not know it, the last months of his life, to a stainless steel dream and a shell company in a Geneva apartment. The summit was behind him now. Ahead lay the long way down. Chapter 11. A company in a Geneva apartment. To understand how it happened, you have to picture a place that barely existed. Not a factory, not an office. An apartment in Geneva, belonging to a woman named Marie-Denise Juhan, a dealer in cars and in precious stones. That address, that flat, was the registered home of GPD Services Incorporated. It had no assets, it had no real premises, it had no engineers, no drawing office, no workshop. It was a name, a letterhead, and a bank account, and through it, in the space of a few years, would flow a sum that would end careers, fill a prison cell, and shadow the memory of the man who built Lotus for the rest of history. The company had a curious pedigree. It began as a Panamanian shelf firm, one of those ready-made corporate shells that exist to be bought and used, and it acquired, over time, more than one grand-sounding name. Grand Prix Drivers, some called it. General Product Development Services, went another version. The names shifted like the story around them, which is itself a kind of tell. Behind the shifting names sat Marie-Denise Juhan's husband, Jaroslav Juhan. Jerry, a former Porsche Works racing driver turned Swiss-based intermediary, the fixer who made the introductions and moved between the parties. Here is what the contract said, and here is what actually happened, and the gap between the two is the whole tragedy. The contract, dated the 1st of November 1978, said that DeLorean's businesses would pay GPD Services for research and development work on the DeLorean car. In total, DeLorean's entities paid $17,650,000 into GPD, some $5 million or so directly from the DeLorean Motor Company, the bulk of the rest from an American research partnership set up to fund the car's development. That was the story on paper. Payment for engineering. Now the truth. Of that $17.5 million, the amount that ever reached Lotus Engineering to pay for actual engineering work was, according to DeLorean's later United States indictment, $137,167. The rest, the overwhelming, staggering rest, did not go into designing a car. It went, in the memorable phrase of one Lotus insider, Nick Sutton, walkabouts. And here is the point that must be made absolutely clear, because the lazy telling gets it exactly wrong. The genuine Lotus engineering, the brilliant, real work the Norfolk men actually did on the DeLorean, was never paid for through GPD at all. That was billed the ordinary, honest way, directly to DeLorean's company, and it came to around $23 million in its own right. So GPD was never truly a channel for engineering. It was a channel that wore engineering's clothes. The money that went into it was never meant to build anything. It was meant to disappear. And disappear it did, split, according to the case later laid out in court, where the percentages were carefully described as alleged, roughly in half to DeLorean, a little under half to Chapman, and a small slice to Fred Bushell. The money did not simply vanish into thin air. It was moved, deliberately and expensively, through the Swiss accounts of the Dutch bank Pearson, Heldring and Pearson, structured to be hard to follow. Part of it was loaned back to DeLorean himself at gentle rates, so that a man could, in effect, borrow his own diverted millions. Part of it bought a Utah snowcat manufacturer called Logan, a firm once part of the Theocol Group, and part of it, it was said, bought jewelry for DeLorean's wife. There is a line Chapman is supposed to have said, years before, when an employee suggested he was engaged in tax evasion. "Tax evasion is a crime," he replied. "Tax avoidance is a science, and I am involved with science." It is a wonderful line, delivered with all the swagger of a man who believed he was cleverer than the rules. But somewhere between the science of avoidance and the apartment in Geneva, the line had been crossed, and a proud man had walked across it without, perhaps, ever quite admitting to himself that he had. Why did he do it? We are left to guess, because he never answered for it. But the shape of the answer is there in what we already know. Here was a man who had built the most successful team in the history of Grand Prix racing and watched lesser men grow richer than he ever had. Here was a man who felt, rightly or wrongly, that the establishment had never quite paid him what his genius was worth. And here, suddenly, was a river of money flowing past his door, and an American partner already helping himself, and a shell company he'd built years ago sitting ready, waiting, offshore. The door was open. He walked through it, and on the other side of that door, though he could not have known the order in which it would come, waited the collapse of DeLorean's dream, the ruin of his own name, and the last months of his life. Chapter 12. The car that couldn't sell. The trouble was, the dream car didn't work very well, and people noticed. The DeLorean DMC-12 reached buyers in 1981, and the reality never came close to the promise. The gull-wing doors, the car's signature glory, had a habit of jamming. At one American motor show, a visitor was trapped inside for over an hour. There was a battery drain fault that left cars dead on driveways. The television host Johnny Carson, who had actually invested in the company, had his own new DeLorean breakdown on him. The stainless steel bodywork showed every fingerprint. The performance was modest, and the price, around $25,000, put it in company it simply couldn't keep. DeLorean had claimed the Dunmurry factory could build 30,000 cars a year. In the end, across its whole short life, it built somewhere around 9,000. And by February 1982, more than half of the cars that had been built were sitting unsold. The company was drowning, some $175 million in debt. On the 19th of February 1982, the receivers were called in. Sir Kenneth Cork, one of the most experienced insolvency men in Britain, was appointed alongside a colleague, Paul Shadwell, to try to save what could be saved of the Belfast operation. They picked through the wreckage looking for a buyer, for capital, for any thread that might hold. There was talk of a private sector rescue. It was floated, and it was in the end allowed to die. Because the political wind had changed, the government that had signed the deal in 1978 was gone. Margaret Thatcher was in Downing Street now, and she had never liked the DeLorean gamble, the vast public subsidy, the flamboyant American, the promises. When the moment came to pour more taxpayers' money into the sinking venture, she declined. And then the story took a turn so lurid that, if you put it in a film, no one would believe you. On the 19th of October 1982, John DeLorean was arrested in a Los Angeles hotel room by the FBI, filmed on surveillance camera in the middle of a cocaine deal, a transaction worth some $24 million, which he apparently hoped would raise the money to save his company. There he was, the man who had walked away from the top of General Motors, the dreamer of the stainless steel gull-wing, sitting beside a case of cocaine, calling it as good as gold. DeLorean himself would, remarkably, walk free. In 1984, he was acquitted of the cocaine charges on the grounds of entrapment. The jury decided the FBI had manufactured the crime. And later, in a separate American case concerning the GPD money itself, he would be acquitted again, in part because a crucial witness, who might have disproved his account, was, by then, beyond the reach of any court. DeLorean walked free. But the dream he had sold to West Belfast did not, and neither did the 2,000 men who had believed in it. Chapter 13. The Two Gates. On the 21st of January, 1981, the first DeLorean rolled off the line at Dunmurry, and for a moment, a brief, genuine moment, it looked as though the impossible hope had been worth it. Think about what that factory was meant to be. Not just a car plant. A peace project, in effect, dressed as an industrial one. It sat at the Cuts, in West Belfast, in a district where roughly half the men had no work at all, in the middle of the worst years of the Troubles. The plant had been built with two entrances, one serving the Catholic streets of Twinbrook, one serving the Protestant streets around Seymour Hill, so that men who would not share a road might at least share a production line. That was the idea. Give 2,000 people a wage, a skill, a reason to leave the argument at the gate. And for a while, against every reasonable expectation, it worked. Men who had never held down steady employment learned to build a motorcar to American specification. They did it while the army ringed the site during periods of unrest, while riots flared in the streets outside, while the ordinary machinery of the conflict ground on around them. They built a gleaming, futuristic sports car in one of the most troubled corners of Western Europe, and they were proud of it. Whatever the DMC-12's faults on a Californian driveway, the people who made it had done something remarkable simply by making it at all, which is what makes the closure so bleak. When the money ran out, and the receivers came and the dream folded, the jobs did not drift away over years, the way they did in the slow deaths of the old northern works. They vanished, almost at once. 2,000 people, handed back to an area that had roughly one job for every 2 men who wanted one. The hope that Roy Mason had described to a prime minister, the hope that a car plant might do what soldiers and politicians could not, closed its 2 gates and switched off its lights, and West Belfast absorbed the loss the way it had absorbed so many others. The factory itself, though, did not stay empty. There is a strange, quiet dignity in what happened to it. From 1989, the great shed at Dunmurry was taken over by a French firm, Montupet, which began casting aluminium cylinder heads there, car parts still for other people's engines. The site that could not sustain a dream of its own settled into the humbler business of supplying everyone else's. Today it operates as Montupet UK, part of the Canadian group Linamar, and men still go to work there in the mornings. Not building a mark, building components, but working. And out on the old test track, where the DeLoreans once turned their first tentative laps, something gentler happens now. The enthusiasts come back. The people who love the stainless steel car, and there are many all over the world, have restored the track and gather at it for reunions, driving the very cars that ruined the man who conceived them, on the ground where those cars were born. The dream failed as a business and survives as an affection. But the man whose backbone chassis had carried the whole stainless steel fantasy did not live to see any of it. Not the closure, not the cylinder heads, not the enthusiasts returning to the track with their headlamps flaring in the antrim dusk. By the time Dunmurry fell silent, Colin Chapman was already gone. Chapter 14. The Verdict on a Dead Man. The 15th of December, 1982, was, by the account that has come down to us, an ordinary sort of busy day for a restless man. Chapman flew to Paris. The reason, according to Nick Sutton, who was close to these events, though this particular detail rests largely on his telling, was to see Jerry Juhan, the intermediary at the centre of the GPD arrangements. Then he flew home, piloting himself, as he always did, landing his own aircraft at the Hethel airstrip late that night. The tanned, driven, impossible man who had flown himself everywhere for 30 years put the plane down on his own runway in the dark. Within hours, he was dead. A heart attack at home, near Norwich. He was 54 years old. He is buried in the churchyard of St. Mary's at East Carlton, in South Norfolk, a few miles from the factory, not far from the airstrip, not far from the test track where Andretti had once driven as though painted to the road. He died before any charge could be brought against him. before any investigator could put a question to him. And that mattered enormously to how the rest of it played out, because the case against DeLorean in America would later founder, in part, precisely because the one man who could have confirmed or denied the workings of GPD was in a Norfolk grave. The unravelling of the money had begun, in fact, with the receivers. Sir Kenneth Cork's people, going through the accounts of the DeLorean company in Belfast, found the hole, the great gap where $17.5 million had gone in, and almost nothing had come out. From there it passed to Scotland Yard, and in time to the Serious Fraud Office, and the story went that the thread they first pulled had been handed to them by an insider, DeLorean's own long-serving secretary. In 1985, an American grand jury indictment set out, in detail, where the GPD money had actually gone. By then the shape of it was undeniable. The only question left was who would answer for it. The timing of Chapman's death, the dreadful, convenient, unprovable timing of it, gave rise to a legend that has never entirely died. The story, put about over the years and repeated by some who knew him, that Chapman had not died at all, but had faked his death and slipped away to Brazil with the money. It is a legend, and it should be named as one. There is no evidence for it. The man died and was buried and mourned. But the fact that grown people could half believe such a thing tells you everything about the shadow the fraud had cast over an honest reputation. The reckoning came, in the end, for someone. It came for Fred Bushell, the loyal finance director, the numbers to Chapman's imagination, the man who had stood quietly at the edge of every triumph. Bushell was arrested in 1989. In 1992, he stood in the dock at Belfast Crown Court and pleaded guilty to conspiracy to defraud. And the judge, Lord Justice Murray, delivered the words that hang over this entire story like a bell tolling. He called it a barefaced, outrageous, and massive fraud. He said that had Colin Chapman lived, he and DeLorean would have faced sentences of at least 10 years. Bushell was sentenced to 3 years in prison, along with a fine and costs. The exact figures are muddled across the sources, reported at somewhere between roughly £1.5 and £2.25 million, and even the insider accounts disagree. He served roughly a year on top of the 3 for failing to pay. And here is the thing that lifts Fred Bushell, at the last, into something like tragedy rather than mere villainy. He knew exactly where the money had gone. He could have named names, traded knowledge for leniency, spread the blame. He did not. He went to prison, in the words of those who knew him, as the fall guy, protecting, even then, the memory of the man he had served. Chapman's own settled cut of the money, incidentally, was never found. Chapman's estate settled with the British government for £4,670,000. And now we must correct the thing this whole documentary exists to correct, because the simple story, the one the headlines told, is not quite true. The simple story says the fraud nearly killed Lotus. It did not on its own. The truth is harder and sadder. Lotus was already in deep trouble before any of the GPD business came to light. By 1980, road car production had collapsed, from around 1,200 cars a year to just 383. The world recession had hammered the market for expensive sports cars. The all-important American market had all but disappeared under a wall of emissions rules and hard times. The model range was aging. The company that thought it was the best in the world was, commercially, on its knees, and had been for a while. Then, into that fragile situation, came the hammer blows in sequence. The founder, the irreplaceable driving force, the man who was the company in a way no balance sheet could capture, dropped dead. The DeLorean income vanished, and the taxman, having discovered what had run through GPD, placed a protective assessment over Lotus and all its assets, £84 million. A siege that could have finished the company on its own. So it was not one fraud that nearly destroyed Britain's supercar empire. It was a recession and a collapsed model range and a lost American market and a founder's sudden death and a fraud that poisoned the company's name and a tax assessment that nearly bled it white, all arriving, more or less, at once. The fraud was the scandal. The near death was the whole storm. The little firm from the stable behind the pub was, by 1983, as close to the end as it had ever been. Chapter 15. What Remains at Hethel. It was saved, in the end, by the sort of people Chapman had spent his life beating, not by an engineer, not by a racing genius, by a car auctioneer. His name was David Wickens, the founder of British Car Auctions, a shrewd and genial businessman who was introduced to the ailing company through Mark Thatcher, the Prime Minister's son. In 1983, Wickens took a substantial stake in the chairman's role and set about the unglamorous work of survival. He negotiated the Inland Revenue's terrifying assessment down to something the company could live with. He brought in serious money, the merchant bank Schroeder Wagg, the financier Michael Ashcroft, Sir Anthony Bamford of JCB, each taking a slice, each betting that the name was worth saving. He would come to be called, without much exaggeration, the saviour of Lotus. There was help, too, from an unexpected quarter, arranged in Chapman's final months, a deal with Toyota, for whom Lotus Engineering had helped develop a sports car, and which yielded a new Lotus, the XL, built with Toyota parts and sold, remarkably, for over £1,000 less than the car it replaced. The consultancy engineering business that Tony Rudd had grown inside Lotus, the quiet arm that sold Chapman's genius to other firms, proved, at the end, to be one of the most valuable things he had built. And in January 1986, the rescue reached its logical end. General Motors, the very company DeLorean had once walked out of, bought control of Group Lotus, and by that autumn owned nearly all of it. The small Norfolk firm that had beaten the giants was now owned by one. There is a bitter little irony to savour, if you have the stomach for it. Fred Bushell himself served as chairman in 1983, steadying the ship, repaying a critical loan, holding the company together in the immediate aftermath of Chapman's death, years before his own arrest and imprisonment. The man who would go to prison for the fraud was, for a time, among those who saved the company the fraud had helped to wound. What became of them all? John DeLorean never built another car. He went bankrupt in 1999 and died in 2005 at the age of 80 in New Jersey. His funeral procession was led, fittingly and a little heartbreakingly, by a motorcade of the stainless steel cars that had ruined him. And by then, those cars had found an afterlife more famous than anything the company had achieved in life. Because in 1985, 3 years after Dunmurry closed its gates, a DeLorean became a time machine in Back to the Future and made the failed dream immortal. The company was already dead. The car became one of the most famous objects on Earth. Fred Bushell came out of prison and served, quietly, as a director of Classic Team Lotus, the historic racing outfit run by Chapman's son, Clive. He died in 2006, loyal to the last, to the family, to the name. Hazel Chapman, the woman who had lent a young man £25 and the run of a lockup, lived on for decades, helped steer the sail of the company through its darkest hour, and remained a beloved figure in the sport she had served from the pit wall. She died in 2021, at the age of 94. The Bond submarine car, the wonderful Wet Nellie that had swum through cinemas in 1977, surfaced at auction in 2013 and was bought for £550,000 by Elon Musk, who had watched it as a boy in South Africa and now owned the thing itself. And Lotus survived. It passed from General Motors to the Italian entrepreneur Romano Artioli in 1993, who launched a small, light, brilliant new sports car and named it, after his granddaughter, the Elise. It passed to Proton of Malaysia in 1996, and in 2017 it passed to Geely of China, the owner it has today. The cars are still built at Hethel, on the old airfield, in 2026, the Emira, the electric Evija. Chapman's ground effect, the great secret of the black and gold years, returned to Formula One in 2022, 40 years after his death, as though the sport had circled back to bow to him. His creed, simplify, then add lightness, is still, in the deepest sense, the law that governs every racing car built. But the Norfolk factory is shrinking. In February 2025, up to 270 jobs went, the company blaming volatile markets and American tariffs. And in August 2025, Lotus confirmed that up to 550 more roles would follow, cutting the Hethel workforce to around 750. The local Member of Parliament, Ben Goldsborough, called it a very difficult day for many families, while noting, with the careful gratitude of a man who knows how close things came, that the worst case, the complete closure of the factory, had at least been avoided. 550 jobs would remain. So, walk the site now, if you go. The runway is still there. where he landed the aircraft on his last night alive. The test track still curves through the Norfolk flatness, where Andretti drove as though painted to the road. They still make cars behind those gates. Fewer of them, and for owners in Wuhan, rather than a man with a flat cap. But they make them. The innkeeper's son, who taught Britain to win by taking things away, is buried a few miles up the road, at East Carlton, under a stone in a country churchyard. He died with his name about to be dragged through a Belfast courtroom he did not live to see. For a fraud his loyal accountant went to prison rather than fully explain. He was a genius. He was, at the very end, something less than that. And the small factory in the fields, the one that thought it was the best in the world, the one that survived the recession, and the scandal, and the taxman, and the loss of the man who was its heart, the factory, somehow, is still there. For now.